So the Yale Macmillan Centre is our partner in this lecture series. And so we are so grateful to have all of you here. And we are looking forward to a monthly series. This month we have the Christian perspective on religious observance and pandemics. And the topic is precisely on the Christian experience with COVID-19. Next month we are going to look at the Muslim experience on the same topic. We have other topics like the church and the state and party in a multi-party democracy. Should the church and the clergy be involved in multi-party democracy, partisan politics? The same with the chief, the same with the mosque. We are having some of these lecture series that have been outlined on our website. I will encourage you to go to our website and look at the topics that we've outlined for the upcoming lectures. One other topic we are going to address is the question of religion and corruption in Africa. So these are some topics that we feel are very important that can be said to be at the intersection of religion and society in Africa. And that is what we are trying to engage with from the Sanneh Institute. I'm so delighted that I have a friend and a colleague who is also admired, Professor Sanneh, who has agreed to open this lecture series with us. But I will not mention his name because I will say other things that he will hold me to account later on. I will leave the introduction to someone, to the chair, the moderator, to do that. So today we are fortunate to have the board chair of the Sanneh Institute, Professor Samuel Ofei, who is going to moderate our session. He will give us some few ground rules when he takes over, and he will also introduce the speakers. One of us from within Ghana here in West Africa, and one of the speakers all the way from East Africa. So he will introduce them to us. So once again, you are most welcome. My name is John Azuma. Welcome to this lecture series. And I'm speaking to you from the Sanneh Institute in Accra. So over to you, Professor Ofei. By the way, Professor Ofei is the immediate past Vice Chancellor Academics of the University of Ghana. So he is very instrumental in the Sanneh Institute's working relationship with the University of Ghana. So Professor Ofei, as chairman, I hand over to you, and we'll try to be on time as much as we are able. Thank you very much, and you are most warmly welcome again.
Thank you very much, Director, for that introduction. And as you rightly said, the Sanneh Institute intends to host a series of seminars, and we hope that we'll be carrying one every month. And most of the topics, as you rightly said, are on religion and at the intersection of society, which is a very interesting topic. Today, we are going to have speakers on religious observance and pandemics, COVID-19, and the Christian experience. Before we start, I would wish to say that if we will allow the speakers to finish presenting their lectures, and if you have any question, post the question in the chat box. We will collect all the questions and then forward them to the speakers for them to respond to after they finish their presentations. So today we have a topic, and as you all know, the pandemic, COVID, has had tremendous effects on all aspects of our life. I was just reading a press release from the World Bank, and it says that in Ghana, 770 workers, that is 25.7% of the total workforce, had their wages slashed, and about 42,000 employees lost their jobs within 3 months last year. And we all bear witness to the effect and the impact of the COVID on all aspects of our life. And for our religious activities, it has had tremendous impact. And for us to have an insight into how Christians and other religions have observed the experiences they've had with the COVID, we have two speakers. The first person is in the person of, the first speaker is in the person of Professor Asamoah Gyadu. Professor Asamoah Gyadu holds a BA in Religion and Sociology and an MPhil degree in Religion, both from the University of Ghana. He holds a PhD in Theology from the University of Birmingham. He is an ordained minister of the Methodist Church, and in 2015 was elected as a fellow of the Ghana Academy of Arts and Sciences. He has held teaching posts at Trinity Theological Seminary in Lebanon since 1994 and is currently a Baita Grau Professor of African Christianity. Professor Asamoah Gyadu is currently the Baita Grau Professor of African Christianity and Pentecostal Charismatic Theology. He has been the president of the Trinity Theological Seminary since 2018. Asamoah Gyadu is known for his writings related to African Pentecostal and Charismatic Christianity. He has also written a few articles related to digital media and digital religion. A first shift has been prepared in his honor entitled African Pentecostalism and World Christianity. The respondent for our today's seminar is Father Charles Chilufya. He is a Zambian priest of the Roman Catholic Church. He is currently the director of the Kenya-based Justice and Ecology Office of the Jesuit Conference of Africa and Madagascar of the Roman Catholic Church. Father Charles is also the coordinator of Africa Task Force of the Vatican COVID-19 Commission. Before his current mission, Father Charles worked at the Copperbelt University in Zambia, where he was chaplain and also taught research in business and economics and history of economic thought in the School of Business. So, ladies and gentlemen, once again, welcome. Without much ado, I will invite Professor Asamoah Gyadu to give his presentation. Professor, you are welcome.
Thank you very much, Professor Ofe, and I'd like to extend New Year greetings to all of you and to thank my colleague and friend, Dr. John Azuma, for inviting me to be part of this. It's a real honor for me to be the maiden speaker, especially I don't take things to do with Professor Sanneh that lightly. And so I'm grateful. I also like to thank Michael Glerup, our other colleague, for accepting to link the Yale Macmillan Centre to this project. So I greet all of you online, and I trust that at the end of this presentation, we would all have learned something, including myself as speaker. Now, the spread of the coronavirus that causes the COVID-19 disease is now a public health issue. When it started in the early months of the year 2020, it was mocked by many people. Now, the interpretations of the outbreak have ranged from the political to the environmental to the religious. Conspiratorial theories continue to abound on the sources and effect of the virus and the disease it has brought. Those who have looked at COVID-19 from a religious perspective talk about it in eschatological terms, with others seeing it in the light of biblical prophecies relating to the Armageddon. In this lecture on religious observances and the COVID-19 pandemic, I tackle faith responses using the practices of contemporary Christian churches and ministries as the main subject of study. These responses are interrogated in the light of Sanneh's submission that in Africa, religion occurs with authoritative force, especially in matters of health and sickness, and in need and contentment. The Christian religious responses to the COVID-19 pandemic have been very strong and decisive. These responses have been played out in sermons and social media messages to the faithful. The disease has been dealt with in prophetic utterances and in fasting and prayer sessions among contemporary Pentecostal ministries and churches in particular. The questions guiding this paper include, firstly, what is the history of the relationship between religion and pandemics in Africa? Secondly, in what specific ways has this propensity to deal with public health crisis through religious faith and practice been evident in the ways in which contemporary African churches of the Spirit have responded to the pandemic? Thirdly, if the COVID-19 pandemic raises critical questions of theodicy for people of faith, how are Christians expected to respond to it and behave as the disease rages with such disastrous consequences on personal lives and economies? Our concern in this presentation would be with the religious responses, especially how Christians in Africa, used to dealing with crisis through religious resources of supernatural succor, have handled the pandemic from the perspective of faith. The COVID-19 pandemic has posed a great challenge to people of faith because of the very existential problems that it has brought on people. I have argued elsewhere, for example, that those who propound a gospel of health and wealth, for example, have found their message calm and stuck in the face of a disease that has not been discriminatory in terms of where it goes and who it infects. In Africa and America, pastors have died by defying recommended non-pharmaceutical protocols to visit and pray for people. Governments across the world had to lock down their economies, followed by restrictions, and within a few months from March 2020, there had begun talks of developing vaccines in response to the COVID-19 disease. It is now a year since this problem started, and in the developed economies, vaccinations have started as poor countries continue to hope and literally pray that help would come quickly. One of the areas deeply affected by the outbreak of the virus is communal worship gatherings. In Africa, people seek solutions to crisis through the application of religious faith and practice. And so the effect of COVID-19 on religious life has not been taken easily. African independent, indigenous, Pentecostal churches in particular, bolstered by a mystical worldview that the virus is demonic, have called for periods of fasting and prayer in order to tame what has appeared consistently in religious discourses as an evil virus or a plague and pestilence that in Psalm 91, God promises would never come near the habitation of his people. The expression of religious practices and faith has been seen in every aspect of African life, something that is particularly evident in times of human crisis. The interrogation of the religious responses to pandemics in the African context can therefore be understood against the backdrop of the seamless manner in which sacred and secular realities of life intersect in the African imagination. Sanneh concludes a cryptic portrait of the role that religion plays in African life by asserting that African communities have consequently lived, moved, and had their being in religion. In other words, for traditional Africans in particular, religion is something like the lifeblood that infuses the understanding of reality. If in the Western Enlightenment mindset, religion is a system of ideas, in the African imagination, religion is the locus of power and the driving force of life. In responding to the questions I have outlined, the Christian prophetic ministry in Africa will be critical. The prophetic ministry has always been a key feature of Christian religious innovation in Africa. This has been so since the early 20th century with the rise of the Aladura movement and spiritual churches. Many of them emerged in the wake of the 1918 influenza pandemic that also killed so many people around the world. David K. Peterson, for instance, reports that during the 1918 influenza pandemic, some saw the hand of God at work in the pandemic, and an open-air prayer meeting was called to deal with its effects in Accra, Ghana. Lamin Sanneh reports how in this worldwide influenza pandemic, an indigenous Christian prophet from Ijebu Ode in Nigeria, Joseph B. Shadari, formed a prayer group that offered spiritual help against the plague. What this means is that religion, as with much else, has played a critical role in the African responses to pandemics since the beginning of the 20th century. The religious approach that some Africans have taken to the COVID-19 pandemic started coming to my notice when a WhatsApp post featured COVID as an acronym for Christ Overcomes Viruses and Diseases. Questions relating to where God is in the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic are rife in African public religious discourses. Many have taken a swipe at charismatic prophets for their inability to predict it when the outbreak occurred so early in the year 2020. Africa's main prophetic season is the December 31st crossover services. During these liminal religious services, pastors and prophets break up the powers of past demonic forces and prophesy prosperity on people in the ensuing year. In Ghana, there was a national breakfast prayer meeting hosted by the president for Christian pastors. This was followed by one hosted by the Muslim vice president. In both cases, religious leaders were asked to pray for God's mercy and intervention. The spiritualization of the pandemic has been given a very public face. I was struck that Ghana's most widely known public newspaper, the Daily Graphic, adopted a completely religious tone in its editorial of Friday, March 27, 2020. The editorial was titled, "Seeking the Face of God in Trying Times." The paper threw its full weight behind the government-sponsored prayer breakfast meetings, noting, and I quote, "We find this posture of fasting and praying by the government and the people commendable." End of quote. The paper even suggested that we may have this prayer meeting biannually instead of it being a one-off event. What was even more striking is that in this editorial, the newspaper shared the theory that there was perhaps a correlation between the sins of Ghanaians and the infliction of the pain of coronavirus on the nation. In other words, the Daily Graphic posited that the coronavirus spread, at least its Ghanaian episodes, had occurred because, like the 9 lepers who refused to show gratitude to Jesus after their healing, Ghanaians had been ungrateful to God. If we take the submissions to their logical conclusion, then a public secular newspaper was suggesting that the COVID-19 pandemic was a curse for the spirit of ingratitude to God upon the continent. One of the people who has taken the matter up, that is, the spiritualization of the crisis in his ministry, is the charismatic figure, the Archbishop Nicholas Duncan Williams of the Action Chapel International. In a sermon, he defined the virus in spiritual terms as follows, and I quote, "The coronavirus is a name, a person without a body, and in the name of Jesus, as we bow our knee and we pray, this plague, pestilence, and virus will bow the knee and stand down and go back to where it came from." End of quote. With these words, the charismatic Archbishop set the tone for a spiritual onslaught against a virus that in the African Christian worldview is seen as being akin to an evil spirit. In the African context, where the reality of evil is part of the general worldview of life, much energy and resources are dedicated to fighting evil. The appropriate ritual contexts are created for doing exactly that. That is, through prophetic prayers, denounce, hoot at, reject, cancel, and verbally resist the presence of evil in society and human life. Religious messages and short videos of a religious nature started circulating on social media platforms at the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. A large number of these videos and pictorial images were either meant to be educative or, in most cases, to assure Christians in particular of God's ability to deliver his people in times of crisis. There was one image that combined the Old Testament story of the blood of the Passover lamb and the New Testament idea of the blood of Jesus as protective of God's people. We see in that image, in that picture, an image of a compliant Jew, a compliant Hebrew man, painting the blood of his Passover lamb on the lintels of a closed door. The words accompanying the image were, and I quote, "The blood of Jesus protects our family against COVID-19. Another individual, concerned that the practical suggestions for physical distances was not being properly followed, has responded to this post with a social media caution. And I quote, "Recognize that even with the blood on their doorposts, they still had to stay indoors. None came out to take selfies, and the angel of death. Do not put the Lord your God to the test." End of quote. One of the video clips that circulated in March 2020 also featured a young woman chastising Africa's prophets for their inability to foretell the outbreak of the coronavirus. "You are all false prophets," a young woman says in the video. and the Lord has exposed the falsity of your prophetic predictions. To place this prophetic chastisement into some perspective, Ghana has, in the last few years, seen the rise of quite a number of charismatic Christian figures claiming a prophetic call and mandate from God. What we have here then is that with the reinvention of the prophetic within contemporary charismatic Christianity in Africa, some of them, the general public feeling seems to suggest, could have predicted the coming of the virus. One of the most hilarious posts on social media takes a dig at Africa's most well-known healing evangelists and prophets by bringing together a collection of their images with the note that they are waiting for the pandemic to pass and then start organizing healing services. It is an ingenious way of questioning the credibility of the charismatic claims that have often been inflicted upon Christian Africa in search of breakthroughs to problems associated with evil. The chastisement that the prophet of Ghana received from the lady in the video stimulates my thinking, some words spoken by Amos the prophet concerning the prophetic revelations and messages. Amos 3, 6-8. Surely the Lord does nothing without revealing his secret to his servants, the prophets. The lion has roared. Who will not fear? The Lord has spoken. Who can but prophesy? End of quote. Here in the prophetic declarations of Amos, the blowing of the trumpet was an indication that something had gone horribly wrong, and God was ready to visit judgment on those who were culpable. But God is also a God of love, who does not like people to perish. The theology of the sovereignty of God means that there is nothing that happens outside of his knowledge in the universe. God is not just omnipotent, but he is also omnipresent and omniscient. Social activities and church activities cannot be quantified. There is great consternation everywhere in Africa. And for most of us, Psalm 91 has offered the appropriate scriptural text around which to galvanize prayer and claim the promises of God. Psalm 91, 3-4 in particular, has come in handy in this situation for many African preachers. It says, "For he will deliver you from the snare of the fowler and from the deadly pestilence. He will cover you with his pinions, and under his wings you will find refuge. His faithfulness is a shield and buckler." End of quote. In this psalm, the promises of God for his people, that he is a source of refuge, is not in doubt. So clearly, the word has disaster on its hands. And if, as Amos prophesied, God does not do anything without revealing his secrets to his prophets, then what happened? This question raises critical issues. And that is what the lady pointed out in the video clip I spoke about. What has gone wrong in the name of the prophetic in contemporary Christianity in Africa? So from a theological viewpoint, the one word that perhaps captures the reality of the outbreak of this terrible disease is evil. What makes evil a problem relates to why it comes in spite of our faith in the sovereignty of God. Obviously, it is precisely because God himself is aware of this human need for him in times of distress that he inspired Isaiah to write, "When you pass through the waters, I'll be with you, and through the rivers, they shall not overwhelm you. When you walk through the fire, you shall not be burned, and the flame shall not consume you." The word of God in Isaiah quoted here might be precisely the sort of assurance that nations and people need. We need assurance at a time when even the most powerful and wealthiest of nations are struggling to cope with the devastating effect of a virus that has been described as novel because its nature and behavior patterns are unknown. everyone realizes that in addition to the non-pharmaceutical regimes that we are encouraged to inculcate, we need something more. And for most people of faith, we need God. So, in responding directly to the topic, what are Christians required to do at this time? People have asked. The result of the pandemic then calls for specific Christian responses in Africa. And I will outline just a few. One, it is a call to trust in the sovereignty of God, which means the confidence to defer to his wisdom in a time of need and distress. Secondly, crisis of any sort calls for spiritual alertness and fervency in prayer. That is speaking from a Christian viewpoint. Indeed, it is through faithful prayer that we demonstrate belief and confidence in God's sovereignty. That is because prayer symbolizes dependence on a power beyond human ability, and in the Christian context, this refers to the power of God through Jesus Christ, by whose Spirit we are comforted. 3, it is a call not to see practical approaches to the issues of life as being inconsistent with the exercise of faith. This is therefore a call to be orderly and disciplined in the observance of recommended non-pharmaceutical protocols. For as I have said, some African Christians have died in the exercise of blind faith. Faith must be backed by wisdom. Our help comes from the Lord, yes, but he also grants us the wisdom to determine how to conduct ourselves in the face of evil, especially when it is one in which obeying authority would help to minimize the pain on people. 4th, in the face of evil, African Christians are learning how to practice hospitality. The Good Samaritan committed resources to help a victim of armed robbery, a man he did not know personally. And if we look at the fact that in the Western world, their own people are being prioritized in terms of vaccination, that should instruct us in Africa that we need to be neighborly as we face crisis. Finally, in the face of evil, we constantly ought to find out what lessons we learn for future guidance. What have we learned from this pandemic as individuals, as families, and as a church in Africa? As noted in this presentation, the preaching of prosperity and materialism have come unstuck because the reality of evil has hit people in the face. What lessons is God requiring Africa to pick up from this pandemic in terms of the message the church puts out? In conclusion, God sometimes may allow evil as punishment for disobedience, but generally, my take is that evil is not of God, and we must use our pastoral resources to resist it wherever it is found. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Prof, for that insightful presentation.
Thank you, Prof.
On the Christian response to the pandemic, grounded in his faith. Yes. Please, as I said, if you have any questions or comments, please post them in the chat box. We will collate them and then present them to the presenters to respond accordingly. So we would move on now to our second speaker. And Father Charles, if you are here.
Hello, can you hear me?
We can hear you. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to thank the organizers of this very important conversation. As you know, religion and faith play a very important role in Africa in many areas, as the Professor Gyadu has mentioned. So this is a very good effort, and I'll make sure I attend every one of the conversations, and I'll invite many more Africans to come and listen to this and also share in this very important conversation. Professor Gyadu has shown that the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted religion and faith in different ways. And in an effort to curb the further spread of the pandemic and in order to rein in the numerous restrictions have been implemented worldwide and in Africa too. And as we have heard, believers are in conflict with authorities, warnings and gatherings in responding to COVID-19. This is because religion has always played a role of the balm for the soul, and the regular religious participation is associated with better emotional health outcomes. In this discussion or conversation, the professor has examined whether the exposure to COVID-19 can be mitigated by religious beliefs. And he has shown how there has been a misconception of the practice of religion, and many have resorted to use religion in this way. It is true that spirituality or religion have power in the face of pandemics or suffering like the one we're going through. But with the coming of the second wave of the coronavirus, in some cases the third wave, the number of coronavirus cases both in Africa and around the world has been on the increase. And since scientists and politicians struggle to agree a response to the economic, social, and health crisis due to the pandemic, many people are turning toward faith. Even when there are calls to close down churches, as we have heard, many in Africa and elsewhere believe that churches are like hospitals for the soul or even for the body. But the question I think that is coming is what is good for the soul always good for the body, or how do we integrate this? Since the disease is a novelty to us, at first no protocols had really existed to fight it. It had not been subject to strict control, and referring to the data, many parts of Africa, especially Northern and Southern Africa, have become hotspots in Africa. The corona outbreak in Africa has become a game changer for surveillance. As Professor Gyadu has alluded to, we know that almost 100% of Africans are religious or practice some kind of faith or have a belief in a higher power. Africa is a massive continent with diverse religious traditions, to the extent that within the same tradition, there have been variations. While we are dealing with Christianity here, we know that there are three main religious traditions in Africa: the traditional religions, Christianity, and Islam. And even while we treat Christianity here, it is also true that the other two impact Christianity or influence it. So this heritage, though contemporarily more dynamically evident, it has a long history and influence. And as we've heard, in case of African tradition religion, it can be traced back to the very beginning of the emergence of African people. The central place of religion that has become so evident in any meaningful understanding of African life in all manifestations gives credence to Mbiti's statement that African people are notoriously religious. Consequently, Africans have evolved and sustained religious conscious communities either as devotees of the traditional religion or as followers of the two converting religions, Christianity and Islam. Wherever the African is, there is religion. I'm just trying to stress how important this component of life is. The African carries religion to the fields where he is sowing seeds or harvesting a new crop. He takes it with him to the beer party, to attend the funeral ceremony. And if he is educated, he takes religion with him to the examination room at school or in the university. If he's a politician, it takes it to the House of Parliament. In the face of coronavirus, as we have heard, the African will take religion to coronavirus. And we've heard the various models that have been used to respond to coronavirus. According to various African spiritualities, which influence Christianity, African Christianity, humanity lives in a religious universe, so that natural phenomena and objects are intimately associated with God. And I don't want to treat that topic that the professor has treated so very well, showing how we can't separate religion from an African mind or from African practice. But even in the global north, where religion is not practiced much, there are reports of people going in search of a higher power in the face of limit situations like the current one. For example, recent studies have shown that in the face of illness and suffering, a significant change of attitude is observed, as evidenced by numerous testimonies, for example, of Italian doctors in the face of coronavirus, of COVID-19. The professor ended by showing the role that religion can play. He dwelt at length in regard to how religion can be a menace in terms of responding to a virus like this one. But he also showed in the end how religion can in fact help Africans, or is helping us to respond to the coronavirus. I'll very quickly just reframe what he shared. First, by encouraging believers to reframe events through a hopeful lens. Events like what we are facing now present limit situations that can bring despair. And positive religious reframing can help people transcend stressful times. In other words, religion can help the human person utilize these capacities to transcend limitations and problems and go over tragedies as an opportunity to grow closer to a higher power and to improve life. The professor has also dwelt on how religion can foster a sense of connectedness. In times like now, people have a need to belong and would want to find some escape from loneliness that suffering brings. And this can happen through prayer, meditation, or other means that help Christians, even if they are set apart, to feel one with the other. He has also alluded to how religion, maybe say through rituals, can cultivate connections. But he's also dealt with, like I said in the beginning of his lecture, of the downside of religion, like it can bring about resignation, denial of suffering, fanatical approaches, and superstition. So in responding to further to the professor, I would like to propose another perspective in regard to how religion, faith, and spirituality is being utilized or can be utilized in responding to COVID-19. And therefore, I'll speak about a Roman Catholic perspective on suffering. One important feature of the Roman Catholic perspective is that the Roman Catholic Church teaches that most of what is important to the moral life is available to both natural reason as well as revelation. So Catholic teaching or Catholic theology, Catholic spirituality brings both natural reason, and where reason finds limits, revelation takes over. Revelation complements what can be so known, both to ensure that fallible human beings do not err in their use of reason, and also to guide humans toward an end that is more than can be known through human reasoning. So the Roman Catholic Church emphasizes this interplay between the role of reason and the role of faith. Faith informs reason, and reason informs faith. Accordingly, in responding to questions about the meaning of suffering, like the current times we are facing, I will attempt to say something both from the perspective of natural reason and from the larger perspective that takes the kingdom of heaven and a share in God's life as our final ends. I believe that contrary to popular views, there is something to be said in the affirmative in answer to both questions, even apart from the standpoint of faith, and specifically the Christian faith. But I will suggest the Catholic response goes further than what is available to reason, and in doing so, speaks to a real and profound need on the part of humanity to make sense of suffering, to embrace the cross, to see and to have hope beyond suffering. Is there value in suffering? Suffering is similar to pain, which has an important instrumental value. Without pain, we would be ill-equipped to know when our bodies were beset by a potential threat. But suffering goes beyond pain and is not, I think, available to other animals. Human beings are capable of recognizing in certain experiences, including some involving pain, that we are in one or another state of disharmony, whether within ourselves as a result of illness or wrongdoing, or in face of a limit situation like the one we are facing, or with others when our relationships are strained or severed, or with the larger universe or its creator, when we are not right with either. The suffering involves an awareness on our part of a harmony that should exist, whether in our physical or mental being, or our moral being, or between loved ones, or between ourselves and God, and a further awareness that that harmony is currently being damaged and rent asunder. In consequence, suffering like the current situation often includes feelings of alienation, just as we are feeling alienated, abandoned, and a sense of loss. We feel the absence of a wholeness that we know should characterize things, but does not. Suffering like the one we are experiencing, job losses, sickness, loss of loved ones, thus does point in a way similar to pain, to something that has gone wrong, and that awareness can play a salutary role in a moral agent's life, leading him or her to repair that which can be repaired, and to develop virtues that are necessary for that reparative work. If this is so, then it can sometimes be problematic to relieve suffering if that relief does not also treat that disharmony at its roots. But it is clearly a significant part of human condition that some forms of disharmony are beyond our repair. Look at how much we have suffered the last 1 year trying to find a repair to the current problem. What can be the value, therefore, for example, of suffering in the face of a crisis like this one? And as we lose lives, we also ask, what is the value of suffering at the end of life, when there looks like there's no hope for recovery? Furthermore, suffering at the hands of others or suffering at the awareness of world's great evils, such as coronavirus, poverty, tyranny, and other forms of suffering, when one cannot see any way that such existential forms of disharmony could be alleviated. And despair in these cases can have other consequences. And in responding to all those questions that are arising in the hearts and minds of many Africans and humanity at large the world over, I would like to end by giving an example of a response of the church that takes into consideration everything that I've spoken about. So I present to you a model of a church-motivated response, a response determined by the church's understanding of its mission, as a mission that is colored or shaped by the context in which the church finds itself. On 20th March 2020, when the coronavirus began to rise at its height, Pope Francis asked the dicastery for promoting integral human development to create a commission in collaboration with other dicasteries, that means other departments of the Vatican and other organizations, to express the church's solicitude, care for the human family facing COVID-19 pandemic, including analysis, reflection on the new social, economic, cultural future, and the proposal of relevant approaches. Accordingly, the Dicastery for Integral Human Development has established a Vatican COVID-19 Commission to take up the Pope's concern through the activities of 5 working groups, which are Acting Now for the Future, which is Group 1. And this group is mobilizing the church network wherever the church is to respond to populations that are suffering, especially the poor, by bringing food, bringing material resources that are needed, bringing PPEs, supporting healthcare workers, frontliners, giving them food, and several other things. But doing so not just as a way of doing charity, but working with those who are suffering and being close by them. The church understanding its mission as that one of Jesus to walk with the poor and the suffering, and even suffer with them. The next group is looking into the future with creativity, which is Group 2, which is doing social analysis to understand the fact that yes, we are suffering, and while we look at this situation as a crisis, it is also an opportunity that helps us to prepare a future. And the Pope here has emphasized that we are not preparing for the future, but as COVID-19 reveals certain fractures in the way we run society, we begin to prepare and analyze where we are not living well so that we can create a more inclusive world. For example, you have seen already that while others are suffering, others are not suffering as much, meaning we are living in a world of a great divide and inequality between those who are poor and those who are not so poor. So using the Group 2's analysis, the church is finding out ways of proposing and imagine a future of a world that is more inclusive, a world that is more just, and a world that is healthier. The third group is a group that is communicating hope. How, in the midst of so much pain and death and suffering, what role can the church play in communicating hope? Presenting a message of hope to those who suffer, whether believing or non-believing. The third group is a group that is focused on promoting dialogue and solidarity, going beyond divides of Africa and the North, the divides of Muslim and Christianity, and see how we can come together in solidarity as humanity and confront this difficulty. The last group is being practical to say whatever we do, we need resources, and we see this in the Acts of the Apostles. So the church is working with those who have means to fundraise, to raise both material and financial and other forms of resources to respond to the crisis. The activities of these 5 working groups, which were presented to the Holy Father on 27th March 2020, are coordinated by a directorate reporting directly to the Holy Father. It actually includes the prefect, the head of this department, Cardinal Peter Turkson, who is the son of the Ghanaian soil, and Secretary of State, Monsignor Bruno Marie Dufay, as well as the Adjunct Secretary, Father Augusto Zampini. And all of this effort is being carried using the theme that the Pope proposed, that we embrace the Lord in this suffering and ask his support in order for us to embrace hope. That is the strength of faith which frees us from fear and gives us hope. In this way, the church, understanding its mission in the world, in the midst of suffering, is playing its role while it itself suffers like Jesus suffered. As a body of Christ, suffering itself, it's mobilizing its strength to communicate hope, to stand with the poor. In other words, like the professor mentioned, there are various opportunities and avenues for the Christian faith to mobilize solidarity, mobilize faith, and therefore mobilize action in hope. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Father Charles. Your dimensions on the and perspectives on the Catholic Church and suffering and the response and efforts by the church are very, very instructive and have really enriched our discussions. We have a few questions and comments posted, and I'll present them to the presenters for their responses. The first one is to Prof. Asamoah Gyadu. If Ghanaian or African prophets failed to foresee the advent of COVID, what credence should Ghanaian or Christians give to prophecies and proliferation of prophetic ministries?
Well, thank you very much. And I'd like to thank Father for his response to the presentation. I think we need to appreciate the fact that the prophetic phenomenon is biblical. It's not an African invention. There can also be false prophets. When you read, especially from Jeremiah 23, it talks about people who have not been in counsel with God, who prophesy out of their own imagination and so on and so forth. And there were some who went to the king's palace to tell the king what he wanted to hear rather than what God wanted the kings to hear. So false prophetism is not a modern day Christian invention. It's always been there. And that is why in the New Testament, Paul gives some benchmarks for people to judge what is a credible prophecy and what is not. I think the most important thing to consider is the fact that the prophetic ministry in African Christianity is a perennial phenomenon. It's something that comes and goes. So at the beginning of the 20th century, we had these prophetic ministries that eventually culminated in the establishment of the independent church movement. There's a reason why the scriptures recommend the gift of discernment, and the church must be discerning so that if people are prophesying out of their own imagination, we can tell whether this is something to accept or something to just reject.
Thank you. The second question, I think, is also to you. Is there anything theologically unique about this pandemic? For example, are there any issues or insights that you have identified which you would not have been able to observe in any previous context of evil?
Well, that's a question that would take more time than we have at our disposal. But I would say that what makes this particular pandemic theologically unique is, one, the fact that it is very global. This is one that affected the whole wide world. Sometimes we refer to something as being global, but when you look at them critically, you find that they affect only certain parts of the world. It's like sports. When the Americans call American football World Series and so on and so forth, So what is unique about, theologically unique about this particular pandemic is that it is truly global. It affected everyone. Secondly, because it affected everyone, it raised and challenged issues of faith and pushed the kind of gospel that we have preached to the wall. In other words, faith has been tested through this pandemic. In the past, there were people who even questioned things to do with virtual Holy Communion. And I see that somebody has asked a question on virtual Holy Communion. But in the lockdown periods, we're confronted with just one option. That is, if you wanted to celebrate Holy Communion, you had to do it virtually. And there were cases in which there were no ordained pastors to bless communion elements for people to eat. And so family heads, at least I saw many of them in Ghana, family heads took on the responsibility of being of a pastoral role to bless communion. So what makes this theologically unique is the fact that it was global, it stretched faith to its limits. So we have all been forced to respond as people of faith to the pandemic. And now, whether the faith is deep in Africa or shallow in the West is beginning to show. When even American evangelicals are denying the significance of science, people who live in a developed world. First, we thought it was Africa that was simplistic in these matters. Now we have seen that when it comes to evil, the negative responses to it are not African, but they can be global. It has raised important issues for us in terms of how we respond to evil theologically. And I think going forward, we'll need to be a bit more critical in how we have, in the past, we have been very dismissive of certain types of evil. But this particular pandemic has thrown us a challenge that as people of faith, this is something that we need to mainstream in the exercise of our Christian lives.
Okay, thank you. This to Father Charles, what would you say about the conspiracy theory from some religious leaders that COVID and the associated vaccine is employed by the West to manipulate Africa? Do you think the response and resistance to science by American evangelicals influenced African Christian responses?
Thank you very much. Just very quickly, I would frame it within what I started with when I was presenting the Catholic perspective, which is, it's not really Catholic. I mean, it's just because I was asked to pay a little bit attention in responding to a professor to the Catholic perspective, but it's a perspective of any Christian, as you have heard from Professor Asamoah, the role or the intersection of reason and faith, and they go together. And God has given us both. Both are gifts. Yeah. And you have heard that reason has a lot of powers, and it's, you know, the human intellect is being developed and developed and developed, but there's a lot that we are still not in control of. Yeah. And we remain the way we are because we are human. And that's where faith or revelation takes place. That's the role of spirituality. That's the role of prayer, the role of seeking God, and all of those things. So we need to respect that dynamic, yeah, of who we are. And reason or the intellect, like I said, it's such a powerful gift. Look at, I mean, right now we're able to have conversation like this because of intellectual or discoveries. Discoveries from laws of motion, electromagnetic waves, and now internet, and we're able to meet each other in space are like this. So science and the intellect, science has a role to play in responding to suffering, in responding to what we need. But it's also true that there seems to be a growing fanaticism that is denigrating the role of science, and there are all these conspiracy theories. Yeah, I don't want to dismiss them for the sake of dismissing them. But in all this, there's so much that we don't know, even about coronavirus, and we keep searching, and we should keep searching. But I want to emphasize that we respect. There's need to respect what science is informing us or what science is teaching us, especially if we go through those that govern us, like governments or the WHO, and if they provide guidance in regard to what is happening, it would be good to pay attention to that. But like I said, things like fanaticism and other related things have also a role, because they frame the mind to think in a particular way and refuse to accept certain things that are obvious or that we should be following. And in this case, it is the role of the church and theologians and other experts who dwell on these issues, on this interconnection between faith and reason, to explicitate more on this. And this is not the first time that we have entered into such a quagmire. In the history of faith, of Christianity, we have heard various arguments, various councils that have dealt with different issues, where reason and faith have been sort of called upon to interact so that we can find the truth. Okay, at least I know if you studied the history of philosophy or the history of the church, there are several examples, not just on pandemics like the one, but also on doctrinal issues. For example, there are certain things that the church had rules about, but with the revelation of science, the church does not necessarily change the truth, but allows itself to be more informed in regard to how we handle certain issues with the revelations of science. And I think it's important to keep that balance in mind. Yeah, but we shouldn't again despair, but we should keep instructing and have conversation, including conversation with those that hold different views.
Thank you, Father. Prof, there's a question here for you. If evil is not of God, how then can God use evil as punishment for disobedience?
Okay, building on what I've been talking about, there is an amount of suffering that, for example, science or other intellectual pursuits have managed to resolve. But there are also other forms of human suffering before which the human person or humanity is powerless. Yeah, and there are several questions of suffering that can cause, challenges to people's beliefs and people's faith, and even to the meaning of life. And that is where spirituality, that is where religion and faith come in. But first of all, the question is framed as God bringing suffering. Yeah, I would like to put a twist to it. Suffering is part of our existence. It's part of the structure of being human. It's another question to frame it as something that God is bringing. Yes, it's true, like I mentioned, suffering, while it has its own evil and presents serious threats to human existence and meaning of life, with the resources of faith, and spirituality, suffering can have instruction. Not that God is really sending it, but first of all, just accepting it as part of the structure of being human. Like for those of us who are Christian, we believe that God showed us that way, that this is just the way things are. When God became a human person, for those of us who are Christian, in Jesus, he embraced everything human. He embraced everything that human beings enjoy, everything that human beings live with, including suffering. And the scriptures are very strong, showing that he was a human just like we are in everything except sin. And he suffered just like we do. And there God is showing us that he is with us. That's our condition. That's your condition, and that's my condition. I am with you through this. So rather than seeing it as something sent of God, we could look at it as something that is part of our structure. It's true there are forms of suffering that are inflicted by ourselves, like the injustices and the poverty. Some of it is self-inflicted or inflicted by others. But there are other forms of suffering which we can't explain that are a mystery before us. But for us Christians, addressing the topic of today, we understand God even became part of us and embraced it because that's who we are. But also, God, we believe, gives us resources, the way we are made. Suffering is part of that, but also spirituality provides resources in us as human persons that help, these resources in the human person that helps the human person to transcend difficulty. For example, resilience, hope, and various other facets of being human that help the human person to transcend, and reflection, and all manner of things. So in short, I would like to frame it, as part of the human constitution. This is just who we are, but suffering is not an end to the meaning of life or purpose of life. Christianity, faith, provides resources for us to live through suffering and to realize that we can walk through it and we can learn from it and grow from it.
Next question is, has the COVID-19 pandemic changed the African religious worldview of the prophetic ministry?
I responded to that question, part of that question earlier. We don't have to define Christianity in Africa just in terms of prophetic. It's just that the prophetic has tended to be prevalent in religious innovation in Africa. Wherever there has been Christian religious innovation, you find the prophetic at the heart of it. Whether it has changed the African worldview of the prophet depends on who you are talking to. I mean, there are people who hold tenaciously to anything that a prophet declares. There are others who will look at it from a more balanced worldview. So one cannot pontificate on this. One cannot say definitely that, yes, it has changed worldviews. I think it depends on who you are talking. It's the same as the attitudes towards the outbreak of the pandemic. There are some Christians who have embraced science and working with the scientific advice and scientific response. There are others who are also Christian, who are looking at it from the perspective of faith and refusing even follow the non-pharmaceutical protocols that have been outlined for us. So you get both sides. I wouldn't make a definitive statement that yes, it has changed the African worldview or not. It depends on who you are dealing with.
Thank you very much, Prof. The questioner has posed the question again, and as that I pose it to you, Prof. If evil is not of God, how then can God use evil as punishment for disobedience? I think it stems from some of the statements you made in your presentation.
I'm not denying that I made them, but the point I was trying to make is that we don't have to see God as a God of evil. God is not a God of evil. He's a good God. I think Father tried to explain that there are different sources of evil. So it depends on which source you are talking about. For example, we have external sources of evil. Evil can be caused by others, significant others. You live in a neighborhood and somebody takes a gun trying to aim at, say, a bird on the tree. The gun is misdirected and then somebody is hit and killed. In Africa, we hear about stray bullets from the police all the time, you know. So evil can be external, even spiritually external, you know, because for those of us who use the Christian Bible, Paul talks about principalities and powers, for example. So evil can be external, but evil can also be internal. I heard Father refer to it. Evil can be self-inflicted. You know, even natural evil can result from acts of omission or commission by human beings. Wherever you go on our continent, you see the ecological disaster that we have come. Look at Ghana and what illegal surface mining has done to our farmlands and our rivers and so on. You can't say that is of God. And evil can result from that. If we destroy the environment and hunger results, that's evil. And you can't say it's of God. The point I was trying to make is that sometimes when evil comes, God can use it as an opportunity to glorify himself. If you look at the story of the man the blind man in John chapter 9, for example, Jesus talked about that the glory of God might be revealed and so on. Ultimately, we have to look at it from the viewpoint of the cross, as Father said, because when Jesus was crucified on the cross, it looked as if evil had triumphed. But the resurrection came to turn things on its head. You know, so I wouldn't say that evil is of God. God is not a God of evil. It's a good God. But sometimes, because of the nature of things, the way we live in the world and organize ourselves, evil can come. And evil can come as a consequence of choices we have made. So if you make the wrong choices, you must be prepared to accept what you find at the end. The lessons you learn from it are what is important. I mean, it is possible that the outbreak of this pandemic was the result of some ecological experiment that we have made. I don't know, but I'm saying that it's possible. So the choices we are making in this world and the way we are destroying the environment has unleashed all kinds of troubles upon us. We can't blame God for that. You know, Adam and Eve disobeyed God by touching something that they were asked not to touch. And we know what the consequences were. Even if you take the crucifixion of Jesus, the case of Judas, the Bible said Jesus was going to be betrayed, but Judas was not mentioned. He allowed his weaknesses to overcome him and did what he did. You know, so I think it would be simplistic to argue that evil comes from God. What I'm saying is that sometimes we should see evil as God's way of correcting human intransigence when it comes to embracing the good.
Thank you, Prof. I think we have a few minutes to go, but I have two burning questions. The first one is, what is the relationship between religious authority and community? In what ways is it being mediated differently? And what factors are at play? Sounds like a seminary examination question.
So you asked me to answer, yeah. Prof. Yeah.
Yes, Prof.
Oh, you want me to answer that question?
Yes.
I think within the context of what we are discussing, one of the things that we have to learn is the significance of religious authority. especially in our context, where religious authority is considered very sacred, and where people take utterances from religious leaders in particular very seriously. What this pandemic has taught us is that we must, as religious leaders in particular, must be very, very, very careful about the utterances they make, because they can make or unmake the religious community. I like some of the things that some African governments have done, including the approach that some African governments have taken in dealing with this pandemic. What they did, at least in Ghana, was to invite the religious leaders and have some dialogue with them. Because they know that sometimes when the government speaks and when the religious leader speaks, people tend to take the religious leader more seriously. And therefore, we must not underestimate the effect of religious authority on religious community. And I think if there's another lesson that we have to learn from the way this pandemic has been managed, it is that one. And I tie this to the prophetic utterance. Because it comes from religious authority, people swallow what is given them hook, line, and sinker. And therefore, even the prophetic ministry we are talking about ought to be responsible, because people's lives have been wrecked as a result of prophetic declarations that perhaps were not of God. And I think that we need to be careful.
Thank you for that response. Father Charles, the last question to you. Would you agree that the true need of the prophetic is imagining a future that overcomes disparity? And who do you see writing and speaking about this in the African context today?
Thank you very much. Just before I respond to that, just a tiny word to add on what the professor has just mentioned regard to church authority or religious authority. And as we know, religious authority has evolved over the centuries as the church understands in new ways on what it means to be church. There was a time when the church was the Pope, the bishops and priests, and the others, you know. But more and more theologians and the church itself in general, and even the church on the base, there's been a reflection on what it means to be church, to be a body of Christ. And there has been a re-examination of church authority. And some of you may have seen the book by Avery Dallas, who writes about the models of church. Yeah, and one of them, he presents this model of a church that is hierarchical, but also there's a possibility of a church that is sort of horizontal, you know, and the church takes authority from there, from the participation of its members. And I think that's what, for example, speaking from what I used to respond to the professor, some of the responses that Pope Francis has used, has proposed for the church to respond to coronavirus is this model, the emphasis on the collaboration between what we may call the church hierarchy and the church on the ground. And there's been emphasis to say the church won't respond effectively without working with local churches. And that's why in this COVID response, what the Catholic Church is doing is there's constant dialogue between Rome and other churches, both in the north and in the south. And there's this dialogue, listening to the bishops, listening to lay people, what's going on, so that there could be an effective church response. And for me, that's authority. That's authority. Because there's communion, there's a body of Christ. And there's a recognition that we theologians, we are theologians. When it comes to vaccines and all these things, we may not have the know-how. So there's a lot of consultation going on. And I'm not saying science as the ultimate answer. There's dialogue, science dialoguing with faith. How do we respond to this? So you will see, like in this response, we have lay people on our committees, like the committee that we are leading in Africa, we have economists, we have medical doctors, we have scientists, we have different, and these are not priests or sisters, these are lay people. We're working together as a body of Christ. And for us, when we get that communion, that sharing in response to a problem like this, then we respond with authority. And I suggest if we could continue to remodel church authority in that way. And so speaking about, to the question that has been asked, the role of the church in imagining, yeah, using these resources, okay? And as the professor has mentioned, we tend to be listened to, both here and even in the north, but much more here, you know, when we speak. But if we collaborated together, and in this case, in the case of COVID-19, the role of leadership has been crucial. And pastors, priests, and all manner of church leaders, they are leaders. We are leaders in this situation. We need to provide leadership, not by using our own opinions to either direct people or sometimes even misguide them, but consult with others, consult with people locally, consult with everybody who could offer, you know, and then together imagine a future. Okay, using the resources of, like I said, the community, reason, science, as well as faith and revelation, and use all of those resources and people like that to work with the community and people with different pieces of know-how and work at a world that is healthier, that is more just. And I think that's possible. And what is being suggested in the question is that we could articulate it more. One of the roles of theology is to articulate experiences, especially faith experiences. So whatever we see as the direction God is leading us to, what God is asking us in regard to what kind of world we want, yeah, there's need to reflect, to learn, and to package and find ways of communicating, whether like by means of oral communication like we are doing, or by writing. And I see that both lay people as well as clergy, both men and women like ourselves, and sometimes in collaboration, we can together articulate what this means for us. And as, like I said, both orally and in written form. Yeah, that would be mine. Thank you.
Thank you very much. On that point, we will draw the curtain down on our seminar. I want to take this opportunity to thank our speakers very much for preparing to come and share their thoughts with us, for the insightful presentations, very informative, and for all the other questions and issues that they responded to. I also want to thank the audience for your patience and your contributions throughout the lecture. And as the director said, this is the first in our series, and there will be a few more. I would invite the director, Dr. Professor Zuma, if you have any remarks or any announcements for us before we close.
Thank you. Thank you, Board Chair. Thank you, Professor Gyadu and Father Chilufya. Thank you so much. And thank you, all of you, for coming. Next month, this lecture series is the last Wednesday of every month. The last Wednesday of every month at 2 p.m. GMT. Next month, we will have the Muslim or the Islamic experience. And we've already gathered a very high-powered caliber of lectures who will share the Muslim experience of the pandemic. I want to acknowledge the presence of Professor Andrew Walls, who has joined us all the way from Edinburgh. Professor Walls was the professor of Professor Lamin Sanneh. So wow. Some of us are many generations behind. So thank you, Prof. Walls, for joining. And we also want to thank Michael Glerop from the Yale Macmillan Centre and for your partnership and our greatest gratitude to our partners at Macmillan. Thank you all. Next month, we will see you and we will send the notice out again. God bless you all and have a wonderful week.